Chapter 2. The Clash of Two World Orders, the Opium War. The ascendant Western industrial powers would clearly not abide for long a diplomatic mechanism that referred to them as barbarians presenting tribute or a tightly regulated seasonal trade at a single Chinese port city. For their part, the Chinese were willing to make limited concessions to Western merchants' appetite for profit, a vaguely immoral concept in Confucian thought, but they were appalled by the Western envoys' suggestions that China might be simply one state among many, or that it should have to live with permanent daily contact with barbarian envoys in the Chinese capital. To the modern eye, none of the Western envoys' initial proposals were particularly outrageous by the standards of the West. The goals of free trade, regular diplomatic contacts, and resident embassies offend few contemporary sensibilities and are treated as a standard way to conduct diplomacy. But the ultimate showdown occurred over one of the more shameful aspects of Western intrusion, the insistence on the unrestricted importation of opium into China. In the mid-19th century, opium was tolerated in Britain and banned in China, though consumed by an increasing number of Chinese. British India was the center of much of the world's opium poppy growth, and British and American merchants, working in concert with Chinese smugglers, did a brisk business. Opium was, in fact, one of the few foreign products that made any headway in the Chinese market. Britain's famed manufactures were dismissed as novelties or inferior to Chinese products. Polite Western opinion viewed the opium trade as an embarrassment. However, merchants were reluctant to forfeit the lucrative trade. The Qing court debated legalizing opium, and managing its sale. It ultimately decided to crack down and eradicate the trade altogether. In 1839, Beijing dispatched Lin Zheqiu, an official of considerable demonstrated skill, to shut down the trade in Guangzhou and force Western merchants to comply with the official ban. A traditional Confucian Mandarin, Lin dealt with the problem as he would with any particularly stubborn barbarian issue, through a mixture of force and moral suasion. Upon arriving in Guangzhou, he demanded that the Western trade missions forfeit all of their opium chests for destruction. When that failed, he blockaded all of the foreigners, including those having nothing to do with the opium trade, in their factories, announcing that they would be released only on the surrender of their contraband. Lin next dispatched a letter to Queen Victoria, praising, with what deference the traditional protocol allowed, the politeness and submissiveness of her predecessors in sending tribute to China. The crux of his missive was the demand that Queen Victoria take charge of the eradication of opium in Britain's Indian territories. In several places of India under your control such as Bengal, Madras, Bombay, Patna, Banaras and Malwa, opium has been planted from hill to hill, and ponds have been opened for its manufacture. The obnoxious odor ascends, irritating heaven and frightening the spirits. Indeed you, O king, can eradicate the opium plant in these places, hoe over the fields entirely, and sow in its stead the 5 grains. Anyone who dares again attempt to plant and manufacture opium should be severely punished. The request was reasonable, even when couched in the traditional assumption of Chinese overlordship. Suppose a man of another country comes to England to trade, he still has to obey the English laws. How much more should he obey in China the laws of the Celestial dynasty? The barbarian merchants of your country, if they wish to do business for a prolonged period, are required to obey our statutes respectfully and to cut off permanently the source of opium. May you, O king, check your wicked and sift your vicious people before they come to China, in order to guarantee the peace of your nation, to show further the sincerity of your politeness and submissiveness, and to let the two countries enjoy together the blessings of peace. How fortunate indeed! After receiving this dispatch, will you immediately give us a prompt reply regarding the details and circumstances of your cutting off the opium traffic? Be sure not to put this off. Overestimating Chinese leverage, Lin's ultimatum threatened to cut off the export of Chinese products, which he supposed were existential necessities for the Western barbarians. If China cuts off these benefits with no sympathy for those who are to suffer, then what can the barbarians rely upon to keep themselves alive? China had nothing to fear from retaliation. Articles coming from the outside to China can only be used as toys. We can take them or get along without them. Lin's letter seems never to have reached Victoria. In the meantime, British opinion treated Lin's siege of the British community in Guangzhou as an unacceptable affront. Lobbyists for the China trade petitioned Parliament for a declaration of war. Palmerston dispatched a letter to Beijing demanding satisfaction and redress for injuries inflicted by Chinese authorities upon British subjects resident in China, and for insults offered by those same authorities to the British Crown, as well as the permanent cession of one or more sufficiently large and properly situated islands on the coast of China as a depot for British trade. In his letter Palmerston acknowledged that opium was contraband under Chinese law, but he stooped to a legalistic defense of the trade, arguing that the Chinese ban had, under Western legal principles, lapsed due to the connivance of corrupt officials. This casuistry was unlikely to convince anybody, and Palmerston did not allow it to delay his fixed determination to bring matters to a head. In light of the urgent importance of the matter and the great distance separating England from China, the British government was ordering a fleet immediately to blockade the principal Chinese ports, seize all Chinese vessels which, it, may meet with, and seize some convenient part of Chinese territory until London obtained satisfaction. The Opium War had begun. Initial Chinese reactions rated the prospect of a British offensive as a baseless threat. One official argued to the Emperor that the vast distance between China and England would render the English impotent. The English barbarians are an insignificant and detestable race, trusting entirely to their strong ships and large guns, but the immense distance they have traversed will render the arrival of seasonable supplies impossible, and their soldiers, after a single defeat, being deprived of provisions, will become dispirited and lost. Even after the British blockaded the Pearl River and seized several islands opposite the port city of Ningbo as a show of force, Lin wrote indignantly to Queen Victoria. "You savages of the further seas have waxed so bold, it seems, as to defy and insult our mighty empire. Of a truth it is high time for you to flay the face and cleanse the heart, and to amend your ways. If you submit humbly to the celestial dynasty and tender your allegiance, it may give you a chance to purge yourselves of your past sins." Centuries of predominance had warped the celestial court's sense of reality. Pretension of superiority only accentuated the inevitable humiliation. British ships swiftly bypassed the Chinese coastal defenses and blockaded the main Chinese ports. The cannons once dismissed by Macartney's Mandarin handlers operated with brutal effect. One Chinese official, Shishan, the viceroy of Sealy, the administrative division then encompassing Beijing and the surrounding provinces, came to understand China's vulnerability when he was sent to make preliminary contact with the British fleet that had sailed north to Tianjin. He recognized that the Chinese could not counter British seaborne firepower. Without any wind, or even a favorable tide, they, steam vessels, glide along against the current and are capable of fantastic speed. Their carriages are mounted on swivels, enabling the guns to be turned and aimed in any direction. By contrast, Shishan assessed that China's guns were left over from the Ming dynasty, and that those who are in charge of military affairs are all literary officials, they have no knowledge of armaments. Concluding that the city was defenseless before British naval power, Shishan opted to soothe and divert the British by assuring them that the imbroglio in Guangzhou had been a misunderstanding, and did not reflect the temperate and just intentions of the emperor. Chinese officials would investigate and handle the matter fairly, but first it was imperative that the British fleet set sail for the south and await Chinese inspectors there. Somewhat remarkably, this maneuver worked. The British force sailed back to the southern ports, leaving China's exposed northern cities undamaged. Based on this success, Shishan was now sent to Guangzhou to replace Lin Zechu and to manage the barbarians once again. The emperor, who seems not to have grasped the extent of the British technological advantage, instructed Qishan to engage the British representatives in drawn-out discussions while China gathered its forces. After prolonged negotiation has made the barbarians weary and exhausted, he noted in the Vermilion imperial pen, we can suddenly attack them and thereby subdue them. Lin Zheqiu was dismissed in disgrace for having provoked a barbarian attack. He set off for internal exile in far western China, reflecting on the superiority of Western weaponry, and drafting secret memorials advising that China develop its own. Once at his post in southern China, however, Qishan confronted a more challenging situation. The British demanded territorial concessions and an indemnity. They had come south to obtain satisfaction, they would no longer be deferred by procrastinating tactics. After British forces opened fire on several sites on the coast, Qishan and his British counterpart, Captain Charles Elliot, negotiated a draft agreement, the Chuan-Pai Convention, which granted the British special rights on Hong Kong, promised an indemnity of $6 million, and allowed that future dealings between Chinese and British officials would take place on equal terms, that is, the British would be spared the protocol normally reserved for barbarian supplicants. This deal was rejected by both the Chinese and the British governments, each of whom saw its terms as a humiliation. For having exceeded his instructions and conceded too much to the barbarians, the emperor had Qishan recalled in chains and then sentenced to death, later commuted to exile. The British negotiator, Charles Elliot, faced a somewhat gentler fate, although Palmerston rebuked him in the harshest terms for having gained far too little. Throughout the whole course of your proceedings, Palmerston complained, you seemed to have considered that my instructions were waste paper. Hong Kong was a barren island with hardly a house upon it. Elliot had been far too conciliatory in not holding on to more valuable territory or pressing for harsher terms. Palmerston appointed a new envoy, Sir Henry Pottinger, whom he instructed to take a harder line, for Her Majesty's government cannot allow that, in a transaction between Great Britain and China, the unreasonable practice of the Chinese should supersede the reasonable practice of all the rest of mankind. Arriving in China, Pottinger pressed Britain's military advantage, blockading further ports and cutting traffic along the Grand Canal and lower Yangtze River. With the British poised to attack the ancient capital Nanjing, the Chinese sued for peace.